And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're on. Okay. All right. So thank you very much, Dwight. I appreciate it. Christine, thanks for the tutorial. So it's just coming up on the hour. I'll go ahead and share screen for us now as we get underway. Happy April to all of you. All righty. So as always, Benum Christine, I greet Christ in you and welcome you to the meditation chapel this morning. Our opening prayer is actually just a citation that I've taken from Paul's letter to the Corinthians that I think will reflect the reading and its underlying intentions for today. So let us pray. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Amen. All right. So our first reading today comes from, again, chapter 4, page 122, and it begins a new section entitled The Royal Way. So today, asceticism is often associated with eccentric hermits or religious fanatics, evoking morbid practices of self-deprivation that are deemed as unhealthy as they are unappealing. We hear of medieval monks sleeping in their coffins to remind themselves of their mortality, daily self-flagellation to mortify the flesh, extended periods of sleep deprivation to induce visions, the wearing of penitential garments to inflict bodily pain as penance for one's moral weaknesses. Many of these practices were no doubt well-intended, but it's hard to escape the sense they harbor a certain body-hating sentiment that in hindsight has no place in an incarnational faith. The body is not our enemy, but a gift, a temple of the Spirit, the very expansion of Christ's own incarnation in the world. If it would help, I'll go ahead and leave that posted for those of you who'd like to see that, and let us pray. So our second reading this morning follows on page 123. Despite occasional historical excesses, the Desert Mothers and Fathers adopted relatively modest ascetical practices. We even read of cautionary tales warning that ascesis or the ardent memorization of long scriptural passages cannot themselves become replacements for an authentic embodiment of the gospel. Abba Poemen, one of the most cited monks in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, was particularly known for his moderate approach to asceticism, which he called the royal way. This was a reference to Numbers 20:17, in which Moses sought to lead Israel through the Transjordan by a wide, easily accessible route of the same name. For Poemen, this royal way provided a metaphor for a way of asceticism that was accessible to a wide range of people, not merely a few spiritual elites. Abba Joseph asked Abba Poemen, "How should one fast?" And Abba Poemen said to him, "For my part, I think it's better that one should eat every day, but only a little, so as not to be satisfied." Abba Joseph said to him, "When you were younger, did you not fast 2 days at a time, Abba?" The old man said, "Yes, even for 3 days and 4 and the whole week." The fathers tried all this out as they were able, and they found it preferable to eat every day, but just a small amount. They have left us this royal way, which is light. So my closing prayer then is brief and reflects the Corinthians text. Grant me moderation in all things, O Lord, except in love. Amen. So, good morning, one and all. So we're seeing here the desert mothers and fathers really pointing to the way of moderation. It's interesting that we see a very similar development within Buddhist strands of asceticism, in which the Buddha tries every which way to practice asceticism or engage in life. The fictional book that Siddhartha has written, Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, sort of explores this very idea within the life of the Buddha, at least in this sort of historical fictional way. But the idea is the same, that moderation is the key to our practices. And I think in some ways grounds what I'm trying to suggest here in this chapter, to ensure that we're not talking about ascetical practices that are in any way excessive. To the contrary, those that are consistent and persistent, but gradually teach us how to love and the importance of love and the importance of grace to carry us where we're unable to sort of make it on our own. And that, of course, is what I point out elsewhere is the ultimate point of asceticism. So I open the floor to any thoughts or questions or responses that you may have to the readings today. Go ahead, Nicola. Good morning.
I was just thinking about that this morning, the trap in spiritual pride for me, and how sometimes I set myself up too many spiritual tasks and then I fall short. And even within that, I've been thinking about the compulsiveness about that and the way I judge myself to a different standard and possibly the arrogance in that. And it's just really ironic that this is your reading this morning and the teaching around that, because it's about love and really nothing else. And I do tend to get lost in all the rules and regulations sometimes. And I wasn't really very in touch with that, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. It's strange. I think that in many ways, the introduction or development of religious practices, which are, in their original form, are intended to be means to an end but we have to constantly resist them becoming ends in themselves. And that I think is just and I don't think that's, unique only to Christianity or say to you or me or to anybody here, but I think it's a universal thing where we start to make the means the end. And you're right to say, I think in the end, it really is about love. And that could almost sound, overly repetitive or trite, but maybe, and Dwight, I do see your hand, but if you give me just a moment, I'm going to just put up now instead of waiting till the end of our session, the invitation to practice this week, because it might just help both be a response, Nicola, to your very universal problem, which I share with you, and I think many of us do, but is one that, again, is, I think, endemic to so much religious practice where the means becomes the end. So let me just sort of share this as a way of what I would be hoping ultimately, to lead us to. The practice I want to introduce you to this week is to make love the lens by which you look at every aspect of your life, both interiorly and exteriorly. So if there's tensions, if you're experiencing even just sort of, run-of-the-mill conflicts with people in your lives, whatever worries or problems you have, if you place before you and all these things the lens of love, what changes? How does that shift the dynamic of what you see or how you see it or how you respond? And I think that in many ways is what the key to these other practices that we call asceticism is really driving us to ask, what binds us, holds us back from being loving, what narratives in our head or judgments we hold or grievances we nurse and so forth. When you place between yourself and those things this lens of love, what changes? And I think that really is, in a sense, the end and the goal of what we're trying to do. But when we focus on then the efforts or the so-called lens, the glasses, and not what we're trying to see through those glasses, we really get hung up on that kind of that pride and that obsessiveness. And what I find interesting, and somebody told me once, and I think, it bears out to be the case that all religions in some, or we can argue whether Buddhism is a religion, some would say no, but for the moment, if you'll bear with me, that when we look at all religions, every one of them tends to have a thing to which it gravitates, over which we become obsessive, like the way these means become calcified as ends in themselves. And somebody pointed out to me once that in Christianity, it was moral behavior that calcified as that way in which we become obsessive and scrupulous. But like in Buddhism, or particularly like say in Zen, it isn't moral behavior, but right practice, how you sit and that you don't move, that there became a real obsessiveness with bodily form and doing the meditation right. To the extent that that's true, may be debatable, but I do think there's a general sense in which somebody explained this to me, that it felt right, that it might, that obsessive way in which we become focused on the lens rather than what the lens is pointing does look different, but yet it's there in one form or another. And I think then when you go from the broad levels in which a given tradition might obsess on one thing, then we look more deeply at our individual place within that context, and then we have our own obsessions still that are unique to us. Say. And so I'm with you on that. And I think that's just the constant challenge, to reshift the focus. If for those of you who wear glasses, if you put your glasses on, just attempt for a moment to focus while the lens is on your face on the lens. Look at, get yourself to see the glass on your face and see how unproductive that is compared to using it as a mean through which you see your world. And that's, I think, a metaphor for what we're talking about. Yeah. Thanks, Nicola, for that. Dwight, please.
Yes, just picking on what Nicola raised about love, and I think about in self-love. And on that line, just recollect an experience I had last week. I was at North of State on business, and The cooling system in my youth just bursted, and I lost all the water from the cooling system. Luckily, I was just parking at the place I was staying, and that to me demonstrated the importance of. I look at that as a metaphor to my own body, and looking after my own health and my body as the vehicle to transport my soul, my spirit, and the problem was resolved. I called the road assist, and they came back quickly, and the car was taken to the workshop, was fixed next day. It was okay. But for quite some time, I was panicking, thinking, well, I don't know this city at all, don't know anyone around here. How am I going to move myself, go back to my accommodation? And all sorts of questions cross my mind. And the same thing during meditation, I was reflecting on this and thinking, well, the same way I try to keep my vehicle sound so I can travel around and use it as means to achieve something. Will continue doing my daily chores. I should do the same with my body, so my soul can thrive and grow and maturate. Of course, there are the exceptions for this comment. There are people with mental conditions that cannot do that. I'm not going into that side of things. I do make concession for that. But I was thinking, or along those lines, how important it is to look after the vehicle of the soul, or the temple of the spirit, as according to Saint Paul. And in doing that, I need also to express love towards myself, to my body, my health, and as you said, not converted that into an end on itself, but using that as a vehicle to achieve something. So that's my comment. I don't know whether what I'm saying is making sense, but I could see that the connection in there between the body and the soul, and the importance of one. So in my case, my health, my body become sound vehicles for become a sound vehicle for my my spiritual journey in this life. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dwight. It's you raise a really beautiful point, and it's worth saying that within Christianity, I think a real appropriate understanding of the body and the soul can never ultimately be dualistic, as I think is implied by by what you're trying to suggest, that there's no real dualism here, that you have to attend to the body as a vehicle or temple of spirit. Because Christianity so early on adopted Greek philosophical language to express its theology, we can easily slip into a kind of dualistic view of body soul that I think was kind of present in a lot of Platonic thought and so forth, but that really isn't central to what Christianity says. If you look, for example, at the Colossians hymn that I studied for my own dissertation, one of the things that really came to me as I was reflecting and studying that text is its insistence that really we're not saved from the world, but it is the world that is saved. And that's a very different view. You had some early Christian groups that really had quite a different view of that we are saved, that the body isn't a temple, but a prison from which we are saved. And when Merton, for example, talks about the true self, he talks about is not making that into a dualistic reality, that the true self is not the soul and the false self, the body, but that the true self is that inspirited flesh or flesh inspirited, that, right? So there's a real central, inseparable connection between the two. And how that gets fleshed out in our conversations around death and resurrection. One of my favorite sort of insights was by Karl Rahner around that, where he really says, in death, we don't become acosmic, we become pancosmic, because we can never ultimately be separate from what is this created order that is in every moment being transformed into what Christ calls the kingdom, that there is a universal connection between the two and not a spatial separation between material world and spirit world. So when we see that perspective, bubbling within beneath our theological tradition as a kind of consistent thought that's expressed in various ways, you really can begin to see the necessity of what it means to love and respect and reverence the temple of the body, because it is in many ways what the spirit looks like in a material world. And it's like, the body is an extension of spirit, one might say, the way your arm is an extension of your physical body. There is no little ghost inside each of us that can really be separated from what we call consciousness as a separate entity. It's all just is what it is. So there's a lot of beautiful insights that have come about, particularly in the 20th century, that have explored how Christianity might best articulate these deeper truths in a modern, cosmologically oriented world. But I think your point sort of underlies all of that, to say that how we respect and understand the connection between the temple and the spirit that incenses its dwelling is essential. And when you're looking at the question of asceticism, then it cannot become a body-hating or temple-destroying set of practices that's completely antithetical to an incarnate faith.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's what you're saying, because before during the liturgy of the Mass, what do we say in chorus in the Mass? We say, "We are the body of Christ," and then we say, "His Spirit is with us." So if we are the body of Christ, yes, the body is important. It's not something that should be neglected or ignored completely.
Absolutely right. Yeah, it can't be. It can't be. And there is, I think, a deeply intuitive human sense of the sacredness of the body, even among people who have no particular perspective on faith, just by the very laws we establish in most countries to protect it and to preserve people from assault and battery and these types of things. There's a sense in which, this is what you get. And somehow the preservation and respect and honoring of this physicality is essential to all cultures on some level.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dwight. I appreciate your comment this morning. Good morning, Christine.
Good morning. I was thinking about the lens of love, which we hope to cultivate. And recently reading with a group of people the book about the lost body connectedness of Christian spirituality. And what they brought up in that book was that what most clouds the lens of love is fear. Mm-hmm. And there's so much fear in the world today. And as I sat with that, I remembered a story in the gospel that has always troubled me. And that was when Jesus cursed the fig tree that did not bear fruit, but it was not the season of fruit bearing. So that it was always a conundrum for me. And as I thought about that, I thought, oh my goodness, well, we as Christians are meant to bear the fruit of the Spirit, both in and out of season. But that's very difficult to do when we're so fearful. Mm-hmm. So how do we help one another overcome the fear is the question.
That's right. And I think part of that is understanding the source of it. Right. I mean, and I don't know that I don't think there is a singular source to fear. I think it's really based on a lot of things in the way we perceive or have been taught to perceive God or the world, or our understanding of worthiness and things which we've talked about on this venue before. But you're right, and that whole scriptural text, that love casts out all fear, does posit love as the antithesis of fear, really. And what does that mean? And where does that fear emanate in us? And how do we recognize that fear so that we know when we're confronting it, and how to, if you want to say, address it or overcome it in love? I've never heard, Christine, the interpretation of that very difficult passage. We call that in biblical studies a crux interpretum, which means a difficult interpretation, interpretation that becomes very difficult to assess what's going on. And in fact, the fact that different gospel writers place that in different contexts tells us that even they were struggling to understand how to convey it, because the different contexts actually open up vastly different ways of possibly interpreting that. But what I haven't heard anyone say is, that interpretation that we are called to produce fruit in and out of season. That's a very interesting take.
It really helped me see it in a new light. Made sense.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I'll be thinking about that for a while. Thanks. Good morning, David. And you do, yeah, there you go.
You and Dwight have pretty much covered this, but can you put up the first paragraph again?
Oh, sure.
At one point in there, you addressed that the extremes of asceticism were contrary to an incarnational faith. Where did I read that? The first reading. I think this is the second reading. Or not?
No, that's the first one. Although,
okay.
So where I say it's associated with eccentric hermits and religious fanatics.
Well, somewhere I thought you said it, but contrary to an incarnational faith. Yeah, right there. Yeah. In hindsight, has no place in an incarnational faith on the towards the bottom of the paragraph.
Okay.
Certain body-hating sentiment that in hindsight has no place for an incarnational faith.
I'm with you.
Yeah, and I think that's what Dwight was talking to, that with an incarnational faith and the sense of this journey of some degree of deification, that it puts us in a place of that it's important to nourish the body, that it's important to exercise the body. And it's also important to put ourselves in the presence of beauty, and through our eyes and through our ears to be nurtured by beauty in multiple forms. That's a good thing. It's not something to be deprived of. So but I was caught by that particular sentence, that it's hard to escape the sense they harbor a certain body-hating sentiment that in hindsight has no place in an incarnational faith.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. This is where I think some of the balance lies. I think what the early ascetics recognized is the way in which what they would often interpret as appetites, bodily appetites, or sometimes passions, could indeed become anchors or tethers that prevent us from being free, chains, because the body has needs, to be sure, and it has to fulfill those needs for survival and its health, but could very easily and do very easily become excessive or start placing excessive demands on us on some level or another. And I think it's trying to negotiate. That's the royal way, or the middle way, is trying to negotiate. Not all sex is lust, and not all eating is gluttony, and so forth. Right? That there is a way in which these very healthy incarnate needs that we have, or pleasures that we engage in aren't necessarily in themselves wrong. It's what happens when they become a dominating force. And a lot of the times within the spiritual life, I think a good helpful question we can ask ourselves is not am I free to do something, but am I free to stop? And there becomes the real assessment of how much control does a particular need or physical appetite have over me. And that doesn't even have to be literally physical. It could be, the way in which, as I was talking to my students the other day, the way in which one can derive pleasure of putting someone down with a friend around someone for whom you share a mutual animosity. There's a certain satisfaction we can get in that kind of gossip or tearing someone down, right? There's an appetite behind that. There's a self-serving appetite that goes beyond loving criticism or sharing how I've been hurt by this person to really ripping them apart on some level and enjoying doing it. So where's that line drawn, for example? So I think that the early ascetics were trying to recognize on one hand the potential for excess within anything associated with the body. And the trick is that the things we tend to become excessive over are not in themselves bad. In fact, they are real necessities, but then have this capacity to become dominating influences in the psyche, the emotional life, the physical life, the spiritual life. And that's what we're looking to free ourselves from, that dominance, that potential dominance.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome, David. Penny, please.
Yes, in response to Dave's comment, I'm so taken with the Celtic spirituality, and there's a marvelous prayer from the Carmina Gadelica, which one says in the morning, which is to do with acknowledging all the five senses. Bless my eyes, bless my ears, bless my taste, bless my touch. And this sense of embodiment that Celtic spirituality have, I think, is one of the reasons I'm so drawn to it, because it is a means to recognize the gifts that this brings. This sense of being in the body is a gift of God, and to realize that it is through our very senses that we worship God. The other thought that occurs to me, and this ties in with this idea of sort of body hating, I think that one of the core issues, particularly for women in Christianity, is this fear of sexuality and the tendency to project on women. And if women would just cover themselves up, then men wouldn't have this problem. I mean, we see it in other religious traditions, and as you rightly say, sexuality is something to be celebrated, but also balanced. But sexuality and our embodied sexuality is something I think many religions, but even in the monastic tradition, is we got to get away from these women. They will draw us in a direction we don't want to. So finding a way to both hold the affirmation of body and the proper balance of sexuality, and not projecting on the opposite sex, as it were, the cause of sin, I think is really still a problem. We don't quite have a handle on that yet. This embodied sense that we express the spirit through, express love through. So I just would like your reflection on that.
Yeah, and I just want to preface everything I'm about to say as not official church teaching, but my own personal opinion, lest anybody think that I'm conveying. I am of a very deep conviction that you're right, and that a lot of that we have almost been taught to fear sexual energy, erotic energy, which is deeply problematic because it's unhealthy, unnecessarily induces shame, and reduces what is clearly a biologically, central gift to something that we want to exercise or deny or push away, rather than celebrate in a balanced way, right? To use your term, I like that term, balance. So for example, I find it very healthy that, for example, in a lot of religious communities, be that Catholic or Anglican, where a person is going to join a religious order, male or female, that there is a 7-year period in which that person has to live with the community and take gradual movements toward a full, acceptance of final vows before they're ready to do that. And that is a long 7-year discernment period. And again, I speak personally here, I would advocate that we should be openly, consciously doing that with engaged couples, for example. And the fear is that they might have sex before they're married. And I think that's absolutely ridiculous, first of all, because they are anyway. So why don't we just acknowledge and celebrate what is a growing relationship? And before we sacramentalize that, tell them, live together. Let's have ceremonies or rites of passage where we kind of take that couple by the hand and not, I can't tell you how many couples have come to me for marriage counseling and still are like squeamish about admitting to me that they're living together, as if I don't know that, right? That's happening. So we get that out of the way, and we acknowledge the reality, and we start to say, look, even if you want to go to, if you really want to be married for various legal reasons, go to the city hall and get married. We'll sacramentalize that after you've been together for 7 years. And that's when we'll look at that. But in the meantime, we can explore what love means and how that gets expressed in a healthy way on all levels, including sexuality, and what it means to cohabitate with someone, just like we do with I think in a very healthy way with our religious orders. But it's the fear of sex that prevents that. And of course, in some communities, in the Catholic Church, for example, where even the practice of birth control almost makes that impossible, less so in other communions that aren't as sort of restricted around those teachings. So I'm with you. And I just think even with our, Fernando and I now have some of our nieces and nephews who are in their 20s and are talking to us very clearly about who they're falling in love with and what that means and how they're expressing that and how that's sometimes hurtful. And, it's a delicate process to hold their hands and hold them to accountability, and especially to our nephews about what it means to respect a woman. And when she says no, it means no, and like all of those things, but not to just say, you can't do this, because then they'll just cut us off and keep doing it, right? So how do we as adults understand erotic energy in 20-somethings and help them channel that, not in a way that's shameful and in a way that makes them hide it, which makes them far more susceptible to making really bad choices, and helps them learn what it means to respect members of the opposite sex or protect the same sex, and what that means to really express this in a loving way, and when it's appropriate and when it's not, and how to negotiate it when they make a mistake and have their hearts broken, because we've been dealing with that too. So I just think it's time for real honesty around this. And I think part of the conversation has to stop demonizing sex as the one terrible thing, sin we can all commit. While we look around the world and, we see such horrors, that to try to put those on the same plane is ridiculous. It really is ridiculous. So I don't think it's an easy solution, but I think what we're doing now as an adult Christian community is not the way to go. I really don't. And I feel very strongly, and my siblings know when I'm talking to their children, the types of things that I'm advising them, and they're behind me on that because they have an easier time talking to me than their own parents, which is probably understandable. So it's tough, but I don't know if there's an easy solution, and there's certainly not one that would avoid all problems or errors or mistakes and so forth. But we cannot just leave these kids to have this shame that gets induced around their what is a very natural desire. Better to help channel that in a balanced, healthy, open way than one in which really sublimates it into some dark corner where nobody pretends is happening.
Thank you for that. That's a wonderful statement. I really appreciate it. I do think we have so much more teaching to do in this area.
I do too. And what I would really love to see are churches sort of begin to systematize this. If we're going to have youth groups, let's have honest conversations, even with parents in the room, about what's really going on and when it's appropriate and not, and so forth, so that we can really help guide them, because otherwise we really are just abandoning them to make these decisions on their own. And that's a really bad idea, I think. Yeah. So again, that is not official church teaching. I'm just putting that out there as my own personal opinion. So I do want to be clear. Carol, please go right ahead.
Well, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, I really love that, because when, in my generation, there were plenty of women in my high school that got pregnant and got sent off to art school to have the baby and give it up for adoption. I have, and that brings its own painful, situation. And, when some of my close friends, when I've talked to them, they said, well, if I took birth control, it was like premeditated sin. But if sex just sort of happened, then because how the Catholic Church just does a number on your head. And I just thought, how pathetically sad. Where my father was very cynical, which is where I get my cynicism. And he used to always have these conversations with me. He was furious. He worked for the Archdiocese of Washington. He was furious that a white male Italian in Rome was telling women what they could and couldn't do. And and so he would always have these discussions with me about rabbits. And he would say, you're not a rabbit. You don't. His big thing was, you want to be financially stable and you want to be in a stable relationship before you bring a child into the world. And, so he was like, I'd rather you get on birth control. Don't tell me about it. But at least that was back in the 70s, and at least he was saying, I don't want to see you in that situation where you're pregnant at 17 and all your choices are no longer there. I want you to have choices, and you don't, but I love that idea, because I also have friends that were living together and the Catholic Church wouldn't marry them because they wouldn't separate. They would say, well, one of you needs to leave the other for 6 months before you get married. And they're like, we can't do that. We can't afford a second place. And, because it just was ridiculous. So, and my niece is one of them that lives with a man, and I'm pretty sure they're going to announce next week that they're engaged, because she just graduated, and, and we're happy for them. She's 30. And they've lived together and they're very, very happy, and we're happy for them. So, but I'm sure if they go to a Catholic church, maybe I'll send them to my liberal Catholic church, where they're a little bit more open. But it's just the whole business, you're right, is it's happening anyway. Why aren't we not protecting? And then you go to the other extreme, where my little brother and I are telling my nieces, boys are bad, because they're in college right now. We're like, boys are bad. Keep remembering that, and that's also not a bad thing. But at that age group, you want to make them aware of, their brains aren't fully developed. College is like a little utopia for bad behavior. Alcohol is a bad, and the influence of alcohol. Also, all these things are, like what happened to that girl in Stanford. I'm sure you all are, aware that was a wonderful book, Know My Name. It was a wonderful book about how our legal system demonizes women, constantly. And they kept saying to her, you're going to ruin this boy's life. And I was screaming, the boy ruined his life. He was trying to sexually assault a woman. He ruined his life, not the girl that's protesting in court, whatever. But that wasn't my question. My question was, I think one reason why people do the body, because it's easier to control the body than it is the mind. And, it's easy to, which is one reason why Catholics put their kids in Catholic schools and isolate them a little bit from the rest of the world, which, I also kind of understand. But anyway, and then I wonder if in centering prayer, that's what we're doing too, is we're, in a healthy way, we're trying to learn to control our thoughts. And,
Well, I think what kind of comes up as a connection in what you're saying is the earlier conversation in this chapter about what I've called the renegades and parasites. And the renegades, again, being those that sort of ravage the body. The parasites are those sort of demons that learn to live comfortably with us and that you don't really see, because they intentionally sort of live with you beneath the surface. And I think there might be a parallel there, because so much of what I think of as the renegades are those that, leave us ultimately in a kind of desolate position of being on Skid Row, in the worst case scenarios where we've lost family, job, and so forth, and friends, and we're sort of abandoned because this one thing becomes an all-consuming reality in my life. Whereas the things that go on in the mind are much easier to conceal. I could pretend to not be judging you, where in my mind I'm ripping you apart, and that's my little secret. Whereas the ways in which I act in the body are there for all the world to see. And so I think in some ways it is, the sort of renegade demons that come out in these excessive sort of ways of acting rather than thinking are much easier to detect. And in some ways then, to your point, more easy to at least feel like become the obsession of my attempt to control. So rather than have this sense of when is it appropriate for something to flow freely, and when do I need to redirect that energy in a healthy, or to come back to Penny's term, a balanced way, where does it really become when does it reach a point where it's controlling me rather than me having some agency over it? If we could be more forthright and not, it's like the lid on the boiling pot, that it's going to come out somewhere. So let's just take the lid off and have this awareness of what's bubbling beneath the surface so that we can deal with it in a more controlled, open way. Otherwise, you get all kinds of things. So I think that there might be a parallel in what you're saying, Carol, around these so-called renegades, which is what we do in our attempts to control the body, and parasites, which are easier to sort of let go of because we can hide them better. They're just not as apparent to the world and much more easy to pretend aren't there. Just to say. So thank you for that. Daniel, please go right ahead.
Okay. I have a tendency, first of all, again, I love this discussion, and this is the first time of me kind of speaking up in this group. So hello, everyone. I realize that I have a tendency to always put things in a Trinitarian context. And I think that we have really done such an injustice to the richness of the tradition when we only, let's say, talk about agape as opposed to eros or philia. But somehow if we keep all of those three in relationship with one another, it just makes it a healthier faith.
You're 100%. I agree 100%. And Daniel, to your point, as much as theologically the agape love of God is the predominant way in which we kind of say that is God, that is the kind of love that God alone has. In the history of I believe Jewish, and certainly I know of Christian mysticism, it is the Song of Songs that is the most commented text in the mystical traditions, which is all about erotic love. Between a man and a woman who, by the way, the text does not in any way suggest are even married, so there's things, right, that are there that the mystics saw as the deepest, clearest expression of love between God and humanity, which is expressed in this deeply erotic relationship between this couple. So there's something to be said for that tendency within the mystical tradition to have done that and not to have taken something that would have been more Platonic in its sort of metaphorical approach to this relationship. And I think you're right to deny that eros of the divine is to, in a sense, already demonize the way we feel eros in our bodies, in eroticism, for example, or sensuality. It's already to sort of put that in a different category or a subcategory of what real love is, right? And Christianity has done that real well. I think we're beginning in our lifetimes and probably a bit before to question all that. But, in the church, things take centuries to really integrate. So none of us will live to see the fruit of it necessarily. But it is certainly underway. And I think you're right to come back to a Trinitarian sort of perspective is faithful to our tradition, which, as we talked about in the Portraits of Christ, has been sort of dismissed too readily by the church for a more Christocentric theology. But then also opens avenues for understanding these things in ways that we can't know or really get at otherwise. And so I encourage you to keep holding on to that Trinitarian base. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Nora, please. Margaret Mary, I see your hand. Just give me a moment. I'll call on Nora. I'll come right to you after Nora.
I will be very simplistic here. I loved this conversation, and particularly Penny's observations on Eve as the the Eve temptress syndrome that perpetuates. But I wanted to bring it to something with my centering prayer, and I must say that when I prepare myself for my meditation, I really don't want my body to interfere. I want to be comfortable. I have a little gas fireplace, and I sit in front of my gas fireplace warm and, feeling no, just trying to get into the surrender mode, if you will. And the as Dwight put it so beautifully in a prayer he gave us one time when he led, "Oh, Holy One, lead us gently to uncluttered thoughts, to uncluttered thoughts and deep breaths, and that is my body, but I want it to be the breath of God working somehow. And so my body has to be sort of put at ease and comfortable so that I can concentrate. So I just make that connection in my own practice of meditation, where I try to just not do body, just surrender to what is. And so that's just all I can say. That's how my body works in meditation, or I try to get it there.
Yeah, Nora, and I think there's just deep wisdom in that. If your body is not comfortable, it's going to be a distraction. I remember, my parents talking about the nuns for penances, making the kids kneel on pencils for their, which is just, or I heard once coffee beans, which kind of struck me as odd. I didn't think anybody knew what a coffee bean was in 1953. In 53, like in the age of Sanka, everything was already pre-ground. But anyway, the idea of kneeling on sort of a coffee bean or a series of coffee beans or pencils is just sadistic and frankly not at all conducive to leading the body gently to its breaths and to thought, because all you're going to be thinking about is how much pain you're in. So, part of loving and respecting the body is to find a place where it can be relaxed but alert. And I think that's really where form and posture become a means to an end and not an end in themselves. I can't remember. It might have been Catherine of Siena who said, in your prayer, take the posture that most moves you to love. And that's it. She nailed it. So in what posture can I find myself where I can kind of forget the body because I've attended to its comfort, right? Relative comfort, and yet hold a place where I can breathe deeply and be alert. That's, I think, the sweet spot that we want to seek. And that's going to be different for all of us.
Yeah. I just want to say that in a museum in Quito in Ecuador one time, I saw not a hair shirt, but a nail shirt, as an ascetic practice, a part of an ascetic practice. And I thought, impossible. I mean, totally impossible. So kneeling on pencils is light stuff compared to wearing a nail shirt.
Indeed it is. All right. Thanks, Nora. Margaret Mary, go right ahead. We'll take your question last, and then we'll move briefly to a conversation on practice.
Thank you. The hand comes up against my yellow background, and it's disappeared. I too wrestle with a bit of the tree, and one more season and one more season. And at this age, I find that I've seen this in hospice where people say, but there's no one left. And I have lost many friends. Some have moved at a distance, but some have died, and some are in nursing homes. And I find myself thinking, especially last month when I had another birthday, okay, I give it another year. What am I to do with it? And I don't, for a while, I thought I had survivor's guilt, but I don't think that way anymore. What I'm thinking of is, what else am I supposed to do? again, relying on that phrase we were using a long time ago. Be patient, God isn't finished with me yet. So what else am I to do? And then some people, I have a friend who says, well, I deserve it. I've worked all this time. I don't have to do anything. And I can't quite accept that I could just lay around and let this body sit in the sun on the patio or do nothing. So I'm in a stage of in between. Am I in season? I like the reminder, Christine. Thank you. Am I in season, out of season? And I will say that my prayer life has changed in that I always say to people, let me know what the needs are, and they'll be in my prayer list. So I'm leaning more to that, but it's a really difficult time of where do I belong in this whole thing? If somebody said, you ready to leave? I'd say, yeah, it sounds like a good idea to be finished with life. And yet I know I'm not. So it's just a really crazy spot that I'm in with this. Another life, another year of the tree.
So thanks, Margaret Mary. One of the things I wish we lived in a world where nobody grew old, but instead we grew elder. And in our society, we don't appreciate what it means to have elders. But I would just want to, where everything is about productivity, as you get old and therefore less productive in the marketplace and so forth, you're just sort of pushed to the wayside. And so old has a stigma to it. But I think the reality is many people here, Margaret Mary, yourself, are really, the question beneath it all is, what does it mean to grow elder? And to therefore draw on the wisdom that you have that I don't, because I haven't lived as many years, that my students don't because they haven't lived as many years. And what wisdom do we impart in that capacity? And so I would encourage you to just think about what it means to be not old, but elder, and not think in terms of retirement, which is really a question of productive versus no longer productive, but think in terms of what is opening up to me now with the time and the capacities I have in light of the wisdom I've acquired in life that I can impart in some way, and do that in a way that gives life to you, and do enjoy an occasional rest on your back deck in the sun, and do allow yourselves to enjoy the fruit of the season of this time in your life. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be a choice between everything and nothing, or productivity versus rest, but around the introspection of discerning, what do I have to give precisely because I'm not 20 or 50 anymore.
So it's balance.
Absolutely.
Which is St. Paul's idea too. So
right, exactly.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Susanna, please, did you want to add something to that?
I got on mute first. That might help. I would love to spend some time in Margaret's library over there. It looked like she has a lot of interesting books. That would be a good day to spend a Saturday. Anyways, talking about elder folk that have gotten older, and a lot of people that I met that were elderly in my life, 40, 50 years older, and they had lots of wisdom. They had what I was looking for. Mm-hmm. But today they're not with me, and I miss them.
Right.
So there's something beautiful about aging, becoming older and elderly. I think without even knowing it, we accumulate wisdom. We endure hardships, and God does a work in us, I believe. And it just radiates. It just does. There's just something about it. Anyways, for me, I had a elderly man that was passing away. And a week before he passed, he called me almost every day, wanted me to pray for him because he did not want to die. but he ended up passing away anyways. So I'm just saying there is things that people notice about you, and it has to do with the Lord. Anyways, I think I said too much, and thanks for listening.
No, Susanna, you didn't. Thank you. Very, very well said and very wisely said. I really appreciate that. And I don't know how many have heard that whole experiment that happened or something where a big tribe of elephants, all the older elephants had been somehow removed or they were killed. And the younger elephants just didn't have the capacity to function well. And the whole sort of society of that herd broke down. And yet we don't spend enough time in our own time and culture to really connect youth with the elder in terms of shared cross-generational wisdom. But as you said, you had elder friends who you respected and who taught so much from their own wisdom, and of course then they've passed. So how do we grow into that role, and how do we help cultivate a culture in which youth don't see growing old as a bad thing or a scary thing, but a natural thing and a blessed thing that they can now look up to? And I think very often the youth look to the elderly as if they're somehow naive or don't really have the wisdom that they in fact do, or are going to have opinions or ideas about life that don't relate to them. But I think when you scratch beneath the surface, that is often not at all the case. It's much harder to shock an older person than a younger person because you've been there, you've seen it. So there's wisdom there. And we have to learn to, I think, cultivate a culture in which, and maybe it starts in the faith communities, a culture in which that wisdom can be shared. So thank you, Susanna. I appreciate your comments. Okay, let's just take a moment, thanks. And I will lead us then just briefly through excuse me, my allergies are kicking in today. So I've presented to you what essentially is the contemplative practice that I'm inviting you to. So essentially to look through the lens of love in all aspects of your life and see what begins to shift. And I'll be sending these out to Joanne for her to distribute to you all. But if anybody wants to take a moment or two to discuss last week's practice, I'll certainly stay back to do so. I was asking you to reflect on this question: what is the intersection between your spiritual practice and transforming action in the world? That's to say, how does one flow into the other, inform one another, and sustain one another? So that intersection between spiritual practice and transforming action. So that, in other words, we don't see our practice as simply something that is self-contained. When we sit in meditation or devote ourselves to periods of silence and solitude, how does that inform or cross-pollinate, if you want to say, your action in the world? And I just wondered if there was any reflection, and it's okay if not. Anna, please.
Hello.
Morning.
I've always, good morning, been one to, before I was ever at St. Columbus, work on transforming the world, but being in community with everyone at St. Columbus and lending a hand to the interests of the community in our ecological discipleship. It gives power and support in a different way than I found in other groups. Even though they were supportive, this is a very different thing, and we're very committed spiritually to, transforming our world so that we can continue to live and sustain life here. So that was my reflection.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I appreciate that. And I think to Anna's, to put context on that, we have recently sort of, since we started before COVID, but it kind of got pushed aside as so many things during COVID, but we've revived our kind of council on ecological discipleship. And one of the real ideas that I'm trying to inculcate throughout the work of that council is to ask not only what it means to throw a pragmatic problem at a pragmatic solution at a very serious problem, but to ask what is the spiritual source that is sort of growing up out of ourselves that has led to the problem, and ultimately a kind of sense of disconnect from one another, from from society, from nature, and so forth, and how to do the spiritual work that helps to heal the kind of spiritual wound from which this crisis continues to be perpetuated, as we do the work of throwing pragmatic solutions at it and so forth. So, Anna, if I'm reading you right, that was sort of where you were going with that. And I appreciate that, because you're right. That is indeed a place we're trying to embody that very connection. Thank you. Excuse me. Any other comments this morning? All right. So as always, it's a pleasure to be with you all. And I so appreciate your questions, comments, responses. I learn a lot from each of you, and I always am grateful for that. So as we go this morning, let me just try to close that down. All right. So as we close this morning, I bid you a very healthy, happy, wonderful week ahead. Happy April to all of you. We are making our way quite close to the Easter Triduum now. So I wish you all well in your continued Lenten practices in preparation for those holy days. So go as always with my blessing in the name of the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. And I bid you Benum Christ in you, and look forward to seeing you again. All right. God bless you now.